Henry VIII is one of the most infamous figures in England's history. Though he was once described as being a charismatic and upbeat king, modern historians, researchers and writers have described him as a bully, serial abuser and an overall paranoid man. His death in 1547 was not out of the blue. His health had been deteriorating for years following a jousting accident that left his leg with an untreatable wound, and doctors and close confidants knew that it was just a matter of time before he succumbed to his failing vigour. Henry VIII was born on June 28, 1491 at Greenwich Palace in London, England. He was the third child and second son of his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and though the couple had around 6 more children afterwards, only 3 survived past infancy. Since his older brother Arthur was in line for the throne, Henry was encouraged to take up a position in the church, as was tradition for the second son. He soon developed a thirst for knowledge. He was privately educated and had a broad scope of interests including theology, languages, poetry, art, music and sports. In his youth, he was seen as charismatic, athletic, curious and religiously devoted. As he reached young adulthood, this continued, although he also took an interest in gambling and jousting, and enjoyed hosting tournaments and banquets. In 1502, 10-year-old Henry became the next in line for the throne when Arthur died at the age of 15, just 4 months after tying the knot with Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Spanish king and queen at the time. 7 years later, after his father's death, Henry took the crown and married his brother's widow. His coronation took place in the summer of 1509 in front of an adorning crowd. Tapestries and gold cloth decorated the streets, and for the next few months, the new royals partied it up, celebrating their status by living as lavish a life as possible. A Venetian ambassador commented in 1519, "He is the best dressed sovereign in the world. His robes are the richest and most superb that can be imagined." But it wasn't long before Henry seemed to exhibit rash decision-making and a callous side to his personality. Just 2 days after he was crowned, he had 2 of his father's ministers arrested and executed. In the following years, this pattern of behaviour continued. After 16 years of service, Henry had a Catholic cardinal named Thomas Wolsey, who'd been his advisor on domestic and foreign policy, arrested and charged with treason. This was believed to be because Wolsey had failed to give Henry the quick annulment he wanted from Catherine. Though she gave birth to his first child, a daughter named Mary, he soon became frustrated that she was unable to produce a male heir. He also seemed largely uninterested in Catherine and began engaging in extramarital affairs, keeping 2 mistresses at his beck and call. Meanwhile, his arrest of Thomas Wolsey sent a signal to others that it was best to do as he wished, rather than defy him. It seemed that the king had become drunk on power. Spurred on by Protestant reformers who denied the Pope's authority, Henry subsequently declared his independence from Rome in a series of laws passed between 1532 and 1534. He insisted that he be addressed and acknowledged as God's representative on earth, rather than the Pope, and all the people who went against him were disposed of via execution at the Tower of London. He was known during this period to have killed 200 people who opposed him. The Pope excommunicated him in 1533, and during a fury-fueled rampage that lasted 4 years, Henry destroyed or closed over 800 religious buildings and confiscated land and valuable items in the possession of the Catholic Church. Using this money, he began building up England's navy and adding to his sprawling properties in London. One of Henry's extramarital affairs was with Anne Boleyn, who'd been introduced to the king by her sister. By this time, Catherine was 42 and unable to have more children, but Henry still sought a male heir, and in 1533 he was granted a divorce from Catherine and Anne became pregnant. Henry subsequently married her. She gave birth to a daughter and subsequently suffered from 2 miscarriages when attempting to give Henry the son he so desperately desired. Again, frustrated, Henry turned his attention to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's assistants. Disgruntled and displeased with his current marriage, he concocted an elaborate plot that involved framing his wife for adultery and murder. He falsely charged 3 men with having affairs with Anne, and she was put on trial in May of 1536. She denied the charges levied against her, but 4 days later, the marriage was annulled and Anne was executed. At the end of the month, Henry married Jane Seymour. The following year, she gave birth to his first son, Edward, after a tumultuous pregnancy and birth. She died 9 days later after suffering a pregnancy-related infection. Reportedly, Henry considered Jane his only true wife, as she was the only one who gave him a son. After a period of mourning, Henry began seeking a new wife. In 1540, he married Anne of Cleves, but before their marriage, he had only seen her via a portrait created by German artist Hans Holbein the Younger. In person, Henry seemed to think differently of her and disapproved of her looks. His marriage to Anne had been a political one, as Henry sought to create an alliance with her brother, the ruler of a Protestant duchy in Germany. But it seemed that he could not get past Anne's appearance. They divorced after 6 months, and she was given the title of the king's sister, as well as residence at Hever Castle. Henry's second last marriage was to 19-year-old Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn's. They tied the knot in July of 1540, just weeks after his divorce from Anne of Cleves. It was reported that around this time, Henry's health problems had started to emerge, and that being with a woman 30 years his junior made him more enthusiastic about life again. However, it wasn't long before Catherine grew to dislike her husband, and she started seeking attention from men her own age. A subsequent investigation found her guilty of adultery, and she was executed in February of 1542. The following year, Henry married Catherine Parr, who would be his final wife. She was the daughter of one of Catherine of Aragon's assistants and had been widowed twice. Described as independent and well-educated, she was said to have the most influence upon court culture, religion, the role of women, and the education of his children, above his other wives. She also encouraged him to reconnect with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Henry's health began to deteriorate in the later years of his life. Though his death is often attributed to an unhealing leg wound and his rapid weight gain, Henry was no stranger to sickness. He dealt with smallpox at the age of 23, and 7 years later, he contracted malaria, which is believed to have returned throughout his life. He once sustained a serious foot injury during one of his many occasions playing sport. Henry had been unable to enjoy a fit and active lifestyle in the last decade of his life since he'd suffered a jousting accident in 1536, which left him with a gruesome leg injury that reopened and became a chronic wound. It eventually became ulcerated, with some reports noting that he ultimately dealt with chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection which can happen if a bacterial or fungal infection spreads to the bones and leads to the bone marrow becoming swollen and painful. It has been suggested that the reason his leg wounds failed to heal was in part due to the restrictive garters he wore to show off his calves. The jousting incident took place at a tournament at Greenwich Palace on January the 24th, when he was 44 years old. During the event, he was thrown from his horse, after which the armoured animal collapsed on top of him. He was unconscious for 2 hours following the accident and was initially believed to have been fatally injured. As well as causing his difficult leg injury, Henry was also left with what modern-day researchers believe to be an undetected brain injury, which the documentary Inside the Body of Henry VIII claimed caused a great shift in his personality. The Independent described that Henry had gone from being sporty and generous to cruel and paranoid. Henry was known for his bad temper and what has been described as symptoms of narcissistic behaviour disorder. This has been attributed in part to his father's insistence that he led an extremely sheltered upbringing following the loss of Arthur and their mother 2 years later, but it manifested in a lack of empathy and an inflated sense of ego. In the 1540s, the years leading up to his death, however, it continued to grow worse, as violent mood swings and psychotic and paranoid behaviours became rampant. Following the jousting incident, both Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon were told that he would die. The shock of this news, Anne would later state, would lead her to miscarry their child. Historian Lucy Worsley stated that this injury would explain his sharp shift in personality, noting, "From that date, the turnover of the wives really speeds up, and people begin to think of him in quite a new and negative way." She added, "After the accident, he was unconscious for 2 hours. Even 5 minutes of unconsciousness is considered to be a major trauma today." Interestingly, this was not the first time he was injured during a jousting match. In 1524, he failed to lower the visor on his helmet, leading him to be hit by his opponent's lance just above the right eye. He began to suffer frequent migraines as a result of the injury. Another historian, Susan McLean Kybet, believed scurvy was a major contributing factor in Henry's death. The condition is caused by a lack of vitamin C, usually due to an absence of fruit and vegetables in one's diet. It's worth noting that the king's diet was largely made up of meat. He had reportedly always had a good appetite, but in his later years, he'd taken eating to as many as 13 meals a day, most of which consisted of meats such as lamb, chicken, beef, rabbit, and even birds. He is also believed to have drunk as many as 10 pints of ale a day, as well as wine, as water was unsafe at the time. Meanwhile, a 2010 study suggested that he had a Kell-positive blood type, a rare condition that affects only about 10% of the population. This could account for the difficulties Henry's wives had in having children. In the cases where the father has Kell-positive blood, the first child born is often fine, but the children conceived afterwards are not. And as we know, Henry's wives often suffered miscarriages, or the children died in infancy. This could have been because the mother's immune system during a second pregnancy began to attack the child's Kell-positive blood. The immune system was primed during the first pregnancy, and by the second, it believes the correct response is to attack the red blood cells of the baby if its blood is Kell-positive. The result of this is that the baby suffers from a blood disorder named hemolytic disease of the newborn, and it can be fatal. If Henry was Kell-positive, some have theorized that he also suffered from Mcleod syndrome. Kell-positive men in particular are at a higher risk of dealing with the condition, which often comes into play once the diagnosed individual reaches middle age. It can contribute to both physical and behavioural changes in those who have it. In the last 5 years of his life, Henry's condition had grown so bad that he had to be lifted to the first floor of his home using a primitive lift, i.e. a chair that was manoeuvred by bodyguards. He was also known to use a walking stick which was fitted with whistles to attract attention in case he fell, as he was unable to get up by himself. 3 years later, in 1545, he was carried around in what was called the King's Tram, a sedan chair carried by 6 attendants. He was rarely alone because he required so much help moving, and his legs were considered to be extremely weak, especially with his 28-stone figure. He also suffered from poor eyesight, reportedly purchasing 10 pairs of wire-framed glasses from Germany at a time, and eventually he had to stop signing state papers. A stamp was used instead, and though Henry initially continued looking over documents to make sure he approved, he ultimately relinquished this power to his closest and most trusted companions. The day before Henry died in 1547, he saw his confessor and received Holy Communion. Though his doctors had failed to warn him of his impending death, it was considered treason to predict the death of a king at the time. His right-hand man, Sir Anthony Denny, who looked after his most intimate bodily needs, suggested that he speak with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Henry agreed, but said, "I will first take a little sleep, and then, as I feel myself, I will advise upon the matter." These were his final words before he fell into a coma. When Cranmer arrived from Surrey just after midnight on January 28th, the king was past speech. Cranmer asked him, anyway, to give him a sign that he still put his trust in Christ. Henry reportedly squeezed the Archbishop's hand. Those around Henry believed that this was him confirming yes, he still had faith. Henry passed away at around 2 a.m. at the age of 55 in the Palace of Whitehall, London. Several causes of death have been suggested. from kidney failure to a pulmonary embolism, though it's unknown which is correct. Notably, his death was kept quiet for several days afterwards. His body was left undisturbed in his chamber. In fact, the news of his passing was kept so quiet that his meals were still being prepared for him. His death was finally announced on the morning of January 31st. In the following days, his body was embalmed. The ornate tomb he had planned had not yet been completed, and ultimately never was. It would later be destroyed in 1646. Henry was interred in a vault at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle.